Shall we instead then move on to console wars?
Yes, I would like to preface this by warning anybody listening, if anybody's left, that I'm going to moan a lot about this film, and I realise that I've sounded particularly moany in this episode.
Yeah. But it's kind of getting into our specialist subject area, isn't it? We're a mastermind. This is what we're going for, so yeah.
Yes, but also, in terms of the moaning, for the last film we're talking about, I don't know yet how Scott feels, but I will not be moaning about that one, so it gets better, I promise. Okay? Just in case you want to switch off now, which I entirely understand, it gets better towards the end of the podcast.
I would like to remind you that I normally put chapter markers in these things, so you can skip forward if you want to. That's a thing you can do.
Yeah, but don't. Where's the fun? There's no fun random, it's just you. Anyway. Console Wars. This is, as Scott has indicated, very much in our wheelhouse. A documentary about how Nintendo was the worst and the smart, handsome folk had Mega Drives. Oh, and, well, if it gives me plenty of irritations to moan about on the podcast, and it does, well, then that's all to the good. Based on Blake J. Harris's not particularly well-received 2014 book of the same name, Console Wars attempts to chronicle the battle for home video game dominance in the United States after the video game crash of 1983, with the plucky upstart Sega and their Genesis shocking the arrogant, dominant Nintendo who, with their NES, were the home video game market in the USA in the late 1980s. Unlike the book, which presents its story in a series of reconstructed, i.e. made up, conversations and meetings, the bulk of this documentary allows the prominent players at Sega and Nintendo to tell their own story in a series of talking head segments, often accompanied by 8 and 16-bit style animations that actually look considerably better than anything actually did on the consoles at the time. And, well, this makes for an interesting story, particularly when the likes of Howard Lincoln are still clearly salty and dismissive of Sega. Alas, I was too annoyed by the film to really enjoy it. One of the most frustrating things about this documentary is how US-centric it is. Part of that, even a large part, is understandable and necessary. The primary adversaries in the story are the US arms of Nintendo and Sega, and the video game crash that played such an important part in giving Nintendo an opportunity with the NES was a US phenomenon, that crash not occurring in Japan or Western Europe at all. Consoles, in fact, hardly being a thing at all here at the time, with computers being the favoured gaming device. But these things weren't happening within a bubble. Yet the documentary barely even pays lip service to events in Japan, not even the sales figures or relative successes of the consoles there. And now on to the stuff that really annoyed me. You know, Scott, it's remarkable the number of times that I don't walk around to the side of someone's head while they're talking to me to get a better look at their ear. Now, call me weird if you must, but when someone is telling me something, I'm quite content to look at their face. But at Console Wars, along, it must be said, with almost every other interview piece in the world, it seems, indulges in that spectacularly irritating conceit of having two cameras and people during an interview, and cutting to shots of their profile for no reason. Though we are, at least, largely spared enlightening close-ups of knees, or "They'll Love Me When I'm Dead's" bizarre forehead-centric framing. While I'm not saying I'm advocating giving a slap to both the people who film or edit interviews like this, and to people whose attention span is so short they demand it, this is a lie. I'm advocating precisely that. If you need something more visually stimulating, then the animations I mentioned are there. There's no need to show me the back of someone's head unless what you're making is a hairdressing documentary. And, well, in the interest of not making what I honestly thought would be a quick review even longer, I'll just list my other irritations. A guy had the mustache after Vietnam. That's a significant part of this. Cool story, bro. Next, the film explains what SOJ and SOA are abbreviations for, despite it being blindingly obvious from context. Sega of Japan and Sega of America here being out of context, but regularly talks about 16-bit technology without ever explaining it, as if the layperson would actually understand what that meant. Then there's the fact that the visuals are either poorly matched to the conversation or are deliberately done to undermine it, and I can't decide which, though I think poorly matched. For example, a comment about Nintendo selling to very young kids accompanied by footage of the notoriously difficult DuckTales. And then, not irritation, but bafflement. It's comparable to the launch of Madonna's sex book, you know, Sonic Tuesday. There's a sentence that needed interrogation. The corporate intrigue and rivalry should be compelling, even riveting, but somehow directors Blake J. Harris and Jonah Tulis have managed to make something mostly annoying. Crazy. And finally, unrelated to the documentary really, but from it I learned that hedgehogs aren't a thing in North America. Entirely news to me. And that US Sega's adverts were rubbish.
Yes.
No doubt those who are really into Sega have come across these before. But while I was familiar with the whole Genesis do what Nintendo don't thing, I'd never heard the apparently famous Sega before. And it's crap.
Yes.
Like, really, really crap. And they're talking about it as if it's some marketing genius thing. And it's certainly no Jimmy and the Barber.
No, not a bit.
Get a cyber razor cut.
Like what he has.
Yes, and please put that jingle in there, Scott, because I've been listening to it all day and maybe that'll make it go away.
If you want to bring down the best in the world, boy, hit your lift on a pterodactyl. If you want to slash crash in Monster Hell or fry the demons with electric spells. If you want to be a Sega nut, get yourself a cyber razor cut.
To be this good takes ages.
Get a cyber razor cut. That's still it's 30 times I've listened to that YouTube video today, and I'm not exaggerating.
I was watching this. I didn't hate this film, but I was watching it all the way throughout thinking, who's the target audience for this? Because it's clearly Americans between the ages of 38 and 47 who vaguely remember having a Mega Drive or a Nintendo, but weren't all that into it, so they can't remember this stuff and really aren't all that. I just want a little bit of a nostalgic nudge to remember some of that, because there's nothing interesting in the vast bulk of this documentary. I mean, what it's saying is Sega sold some consoles, Nintendo sold some consoles, and they had adverts for them. Ooh. There's a very brief amount of interesting bits when it gets towards the end of this, when it all fell apart, which is actually much more interesting, where it's starting to talk about the absolute dysfunctional relationship between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. And I know you couldn't make a documentary about that and get these talking heads in because they're not going to want to talk about it and probably contractually couldn't talk about it. But that's actually the interesting bit, the way that Sega of Japan were almost hobbling Sega of America, or at the very least the way they were running as two completely separate offices, often at completely different heads to each other. And that led to all these hardware screw-ups that they made up. And
bye-bye Sega.
Yeah, and eventually leading to their exit from the market. And it misses a critical trick in not even mentioning Sony until the last, 5 minutes of this film, which was, it was mentioned they were supposed to be working with Mega Drive, but they were actually going to make the Sony's the Nintendo CD system at one point before they went off and made the PlayStation, which entirely changed the landscape of games going forward. So I think they've just kind of picked the wrong focus on this. They've picked a bit. Maybe it's actually more interesting to Americans. I don't know, but I mean the way that. Looking at it from a European perspective, where we were never really any. I mean, the NES wasn't really that big of a thing here, and I've not checked the numbers I meant to, but I'm fairly certain the Master System outsold it. If it didn't, it would have come close, and neither of them, as you mentioned, Drew, have even the slightest, nothing even remotely comparable to the home computer ecosystems, which have been going for much longer. So yeah, it's just of almost no interest at all, other than sort of a vague curiosity for Europeans to see what was going on in the American market if you didn't know already. And I think most people kind of do. This story has been told more than enough times in the gaming enthusiast sort of circles that we might run in. Actually, it'd be much more interesting to see something about this time frame told from a European perspective, because I've heard even younger European and British gamers, when they talk about this time frame, they've kind of internalized this American race of how it went, and they don't remember what it was like because they weren't around at the time. But it was a very different landscape in Europe. It was an even more different landscape in Japan. And maybe comparing all that would have been a bit more interesting for a global audience. As it is, as I say, it's a very narrow audience that would have any interest in console wars, and even then, I don't think it says all that much interesting about it. Yeah,
Yeah,
I didn't hate it, but I can't possibly recommend it because it doesn't tell you anything useful.
I was hating the way it was made rather than what was in it. I was more like, I wish there was something more here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'll say really it's incredibly US centric, but it clearly suffers for it for a lot of the reasons you say. And I mentioned that it doesn't even really mention the sales figures or anything in Japan. It's like Japan was a really big market, and you can understand, right, if say the Mega Drive was not doing as well, the SNES wasn't doing as well, whatever it was, and you mentioned like how things were in Japan, set Europe aside at the moment, right?
Yeah.
It's always been the red-headed stepchild in the console space in terms of how the companies treat it. It's surely that would at least explain some of the decisions potentially.
Yeah, yeah.
If like how it's doing in the domestic market, which they understand better, that sort of thing. And it's just not there. And yes, it's really US because consoles really weren't a thing in Europe until the Mega Drive.
Yeah.
I think the Master System had been bigger, so Sega managed to get more of an entry into Europe, but the Mega Drive was the big one in Europe, way bigger than the SNES.
Yeah.
There may have been reasons for that, though, and it may have come out of like US marketing or something. So like, could have affected the rest of it. There's nothing in there, and yeah, so it's so strange that I hadn't thought about that the whole sort of internalizing the thing. But certainly, I know that the video game console crash is like quite well known here, even though it didn't happen.
Yes.
There was something of a home computer game crash, I think the year after that, maybe 2 years after. Although that was to do with like marketing. I think it was just like basically a race to the bottom in price, and the piracy, easy piracy of cassettes and things were a bigger issue there.
Yeah.
Sort of different factors. Yeah, apparently the 2600 only sold 30,000 units in the Netherlands, which had 14 million people at the time. So, like, you know, consoles were not a big thing in Europe at all. That was a massive console in the United States. So, I think you're right. There's certainly a lot more interest, I think, to be had. And you're right about it, you'd have difficulty getting as much access, but there's much more interest to be had in like, the downfall of Sega in particular.
Yeah.
Nintendo is probably less into because they had a few missteps. The N64 was a bit weird in sticking to cartridges. The GameCube was definitely the also ran of that generation. And you know, Nintendo had basically burned all the bridges with third-party developers by that point.
Yeah.
But they came back with the Wii, and people know it, Nintendo was still around. But Sega, going down, but also Nintendo's own arrogance leading to the rise of the PlayStation.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, the fact they were originally going to make a SNES CD thing with Sony, and then decided at a trade show to publicly embarrass Sony and say, look, we're making this one with Philips now.
Yeah.
And Sony is like, just like, well, right then, hold our pint. And I mean, all know what happened after that. It's like Nintendo nearly went out of business.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot more interest to be had there. It's like this, I think it could have been quite interesting if they'd focused more on like Howard Lincoln. He is so salty. He clearly thinks that Sega were never anything.
Yeah.
And like somehow this was a mistake that any of this happened. Yeah. And you kind of go like they take a slightly cattier tone.
Yeah.
Almost like soap operas, like the backbiting and stuff. Like it'd at least be entertaining.
Yes.
Whereas this is, it's not like it's completely devoid of entertainment, but there's not an awful lot in it.
Yeah.
Apart from, you know, seeing Tom Kalinske, is it Kalinske,
I think it is, yeah.
Tom Kalinski's ears, you know, and that's really important. And see the executive vice president of Sega America, the Japanese guy, we see him from behind and like, well, this is telling me lots and lots.
Yeah. It's important we know which hotel he stayed in. Yeah, that's...
Yeah. And really, that moustache story, Scott, I was riveting.
Cool story, as you say, bro.
Yes. So, yes, a big disappointment in the end. I don't know for maybe American viewers, like it's going to like tick nostalgia boxes or something. But it's not going to inform because there's no information there. Really, the whole 16-bit thing too, is because like Tom Kalinski's talking about the guy from Sega visiting him on the beach and like we're going to have 16-bit technology. Like because you were talking about more like a casual audience, people who were never like really into it, otherwise they'd remember this, Scott.
Yeah.
They're still not going to know what 16-bit means.
Yeah.
Like what the difference is. Like, well, I guess it's a bigger number, so it's better. That's obviously how it was marketed a lot, but it's the way they talk about that as if people would just know. And then they spell out other really obvious. No, it's a weirdly constructed film.
Yeah, I mean, if hearing about this has raised any interest, you can get much the same information from any number of blog posts that will take you about 5 minutes to read, rather than 90 plus minutes of this, which didn't really add anything useful to it, despite all the access that they had.
Or like look up the gaming historian on YouTube or something like that. There's so many much more informative and shorter ways to do it, which tend also not to have really irritating camera angles. So. Which is a pity, because this is the stuff that we love. And, it's the time we were growing up and getting into video games and stuff. So I was quite looking forward to this now. No, it's a bit rubbish. Okay.